classic criticism has never paid any attention to the reader. For it, the writer is the only person in literature. We are now beginning to let ourselves be fooled no longer by the arrogant antiphrasical recriminations of good society in favor of the very thing it sets aside, ignores, smothers, or destroys. We know that to give writing its future, it is necessary to overthrow the myth. The birth of the reader must be at the cost of the death of the author. The Death of the Author was a 1967 essay written by French literary critic and philosopher Roland Barthes. Even if you're not familiar with the man himself, chances are you've come across the term before when discussing modern media criticism. The term is used a lot in the internet age, but it's been used so often that its true meaning has become twisted and otherwise lost. The irony of that statement will become apparent very shortly. So in order to understand what Death of the Author is all about, it helps to have context for how media criticism was conducted at the time when Barthes was writing his essay. Around the time of the essay's original publication, it was broadly accepted that the author was the one that determined the meaning of their work, and that there was one correct interpretation. Just one. Understand that I'm using author and text as shorthand, because that's what Barthes was talking about at the time. He was largely discussing books. Nowadays, you could substitute the word author for any other creative person, and you could substitute text for anything that person has produced. But I will be sticking with the terms text and author for the sake of simplicity. The popular school of thought, which Barthes referred to as classic criticism, was that because the author was the creator of their work, they alone could determine the meaning of their text. Whether that was based on their background, their identity, their politics, or their intent while writing the piece, that was what was most important. But if a reader was careful enough and paid close attention, they would be able to derive the one true meaning of the text. However, Barthes suggested that this was perhaps an outdated way to view someone else's work. In fact, he suggested that we should view the author as merely a vessel for the different words put onto the page. Who the author was and what their intentions were doesn't ultimately matter when trying to interpret a text, because the readers are going to be the ones who give it meaning. Let me give you a quick example. Stephenie Meyer's Twilight series, I don't own the actual books, is at its core about the relationship between the human teenager Bella Swan and the immortal vampire Edward Cullen. And during the events of the series, we learn a few key details about their relationship, including Edward is at least 100 years old, but is stuck at the physical age of 17. Edward sneaks into Bella's room at night to watch her sleep on many occasions. Bella is willing to put her life in danger so she can see visions of Edward after he moves away. Bella gets married to Edward at the age of 18 after she graduates high school. And when Bella gets pregnant with a baby that could result in her death, Edward tells her to terminate it because he could never love it if it killed her. Now, if we were using classic criticism to analyze this book, then it is without a doubt a love story. To quote Stephenie Meyer back in 2013 when she was talking about this book, I never decide to put a message in anything. I decide on a story that I think is exciting and I entertain myself, and then some of it obviously reflects my personal experience. What I think says true love is different than what a lot of other people do, so it's just what my subconscious puts out there. To me, true love is that you would hurt yourself before you would hurt your partner. You would do anything to make them happy, even at your own expense. There's nothing selfish about true love. It's not about what you want. It's about what makes them happy. But you probably know that that's not really what everybody thinks. Plenty of people have called this book predatory, abusive, creepy, stalkerish, pedophilic, all sorts of things. Very few of them actually any good. And when people do that, that's Death of the Author. Because it doesn't matter what the author's intent was. Once they've published their book, it's completely out of their hands how the readers are going to interpret it. So it's up to the readers to determine what the true story is actually about based on what they read and the context clues that they pick up on. And sometimes that's not going to be what the author intended. Death of the Author is meant to empower readers, and it acknowledges that many people can look at the same details differently, but it's not going to say that any one of them is wrong. To provide another example, Frankenstein, or Frankenstein as my English teacher called it back in high school, is over 200 years old, and there are dozens of different scholarly papers out there discussing this book through different topics, including feminism, man playing God, ethical science practices, parenthood, xenophobia, bodily autonomy, transhumanism. My favorite interpretation of this book, though, is that Victor Frankenstein is just the embodiment of what it means to be a freshman entering college for the first time. That's another thing to appreciate about Death of the Author. It acknowledges that not everybody who reads the work is going to be a trained literary critic. We may not know why the curtains are blue, but we can still engage with the text meaningfully and have fun discussing it. Saying that there's only one correct way to interpret a story kind of sucks the fun out of discussing it with people. When my high school English class read A Rose for Emily by William Faulkner, we spent an entire class period discussing whether we thought a character was gay and how sympathetic the titular Emily actually is. It was a really fun class period, and it's something that my friends and I still talk about 5 years later. That's why I read the original passage that Death of the Author was codified in, because a lot of people don't often talk about that first part. It's less about the author in this case, and it's a lot more about the reader's experience. But remember, Death of the Author is a method of media criticism, not the only method. It's a tool. So while it can be useful under some circumstances, there are valid reasons to be mindful of how it's used. Back in Barth's time, the distance between the author and the reader was much further apart. Sure, a reader could read blog posts, go to lectures, write letters, etc., but that was still a very one-way avenue of communication. It wasn't very easy to actually pick at an author's brain and figure out what they were thinking. Nowadays, people are connected by the internet. It's much easier to reach out now and ask an author about something that they've written than it was back in the late 60s. What's more is that authors can now publicly offer information and clarification that they hadn't before, and it's much more likely that it's going to be seen by their fan base. They can even retroactively condemn something they've written in the past and apologize for it if they feel like their viewpoints have changed since they first wrote it. Should we not listen to them then because they've already written it? That's another thing. People are usually a little hesitant to fully divorce an author's identity from something they've produced, because that is a piece of their own humanity in there, isn't it? And besides that, historically, academia has had the tendency to erase controversial parts of an author's identity while still talking about the book. Case in point, this book got Oscar Wilde charged with sodomy laws, and apparently the gayest parts were cut out of it. Literary criticism is and has been heteronormative, what I define as heteroglossia, continually reading texts as straight, not because there is anything particularly heterosexual about them, but because heterosexuality is the default sexuality. If no organs or partners are labeled, the assumption is heterosexuality. While it might not be politically correct to write this, heteronormative reading practices may have allowed some writers to create much more homoerotic texts because the readers were intentionally oblivious. People will overlook interpretations of a text that they don't want to see, even if it's on a subconscious level. And that frequently happened to authors who had identities or ideologies that were considered deviant at the time. People may not have wanted to acknowledge that people like that existed. It's like the time that people tried to act like we couldn't know for certain if Terry Pratchett was anti-trans or not, even though he wrote a book like Monstrous Regiment, which is... well, to me, it was pretty clear what his stance was. People will also take liberties with the story's messages, even if they aren't very grounded in evidence presented by the book. Like, if you read The Great Gatsby and the message you took away from that was that Jay Gatsby was a great, fantastic person and that his love with Daisy was something pure and special, I wouldn't necessarily say you were wrong, but I would be very interested to know how you came to that conclusion, if you catch my drift. But perhaps the biggest reason to be mindful of how Death of the Author is used is when it's conflated with its far more politically charged sister, the separation of art from the artist. They're very similar concepts, and it's difficult to talk about one without talking about the other. Both of them decenter the author when it comes to the story. However, it's important to understand the differences that are present. So let's pick a couple of authors that we could examine. How about H.P. Lovecraft and J.K. Rowling? Both of them experienced intense hardships throughout their lives, and they've gone on to be very influential in pop culture. Lovecraftian horror is basically its own horror genre, and who doesn't know about Harry Potter nowadays? However, both of them have received a lot of public scrutiny and criticism for some of their ideas and how those might have leaked into some of their works. Lovecraft was pretty terrified of everything that existed outside his front door. To quote Lucy Santee in her article, The Heroic Nerd, Lovecraft was also frightened of invertebrates, marine life in general, temperatures below freezing, fat people, people of other races, race mixing, slums, percussion instruments, caves, cellars, old age, great expanses of time, monumental architecture, non-Euclidean geometry, deserts, oceans, rats, dogs, the New England countryside, New York City, fungi, molds, viscous substances, medical experiments, dreams, brittle textures, gelatinous textures, the color gray, plant life of diverse sorts, memory lapses, old books, hereditary, mists, gases, whistling, whispering. The things that did not frighten him would probably make a shorter list. Coincidentally, I'm afraid of 10 of those things. And while some of those fears are slightly exaggerated, there are some very noticeable trends in how Lovecraft tends to characterize his villains. If you're not familiar, in The Call of Cthulhu, Lovecraft makes it very clear that all of the evil cult members are very not white. Yeah. As for J.K. Rowling, she's become a lot more vocal about her anti-transgender beliefs and her distaste for politics that would grant them more legal rights. In the wake of that, it drew a lot more attention to how she tended to characterize villainous women in Harry Potter as being a little bit more masculine and hairy, while also condemning women who are overly feminine and girly. That, in addition to age-old criticisms of, the goblins being anti-Semitic caricatures, Cho Chang, Kingsley, Shacklebolt, the house elves as a whole, lycanthropy being an allegory for AIDS. The list of J.K. Rowling's criticisms is only slightly shorter than Lovecraft's list of fears. But going back to Death of the Author, that concept is frequently used to say that you can still enjoy someone else's work, even if you condemn the actions and the politics of the author who wrote the story. And I'll be the first to say that I can understand the appeal. I love Agatha Christie novels so much, but sometimes I'm very rudely reminded that she was also a white British woman in the 1920s, and lots of racism in some of these books. But that's the common mistake. Death of the Author is fundamentally about the text itself. What do you think it means as the reader? And why do you think that way? Is it because of who you are, certain context clues, or what? The separation of art from the artist tends to talk a little bit more about the real-world influence. Who wrote this book? How do you choose to support the author? And what does your support mean? Lovecraft died in the 1930s. The man was so terrified of doctors that he didn't realize until about a month before his death that he had intestinal cancer. But even before then, Lovecraft didn't really have a whole lot of power. He wasn't really well known, and most of the stuff that he did publish was done so in pulpy magazines. On the occasions that he could get over his fear of criticism. It wasn't until about 40 years later, when academics started taking an interest in his work, that Lovecraft really became well known. But by that point, he was long since dead, and if he came back to life, I'm pretty sure he would be terrified of himself. Most of his stuff is available for free online, and even if you do buy something, the money usually goes to... allegedly one of these people. Sources are divided. All this to say that Lovecraft really doesn't have any power that he can use, and didn't really have any to begin with. So when you buy one of his anthologies or read through one of his stories online, it's difficult to make the argument that you're somehow giving him power because he's dead. But Rowling is still alive and active within the public eye. Lots of her books and movies are still being published with her name on it, in addition to a bunch of merchandise, talk shows, and that theme park that she has that I never got to go to. But aside from still receiving money, Rowling has a lot of power that I'm not sure many people are aware of. She's published an article discussing her fears of transgender people, and in 2020, a senator in Oklahoma actually directly quoted her before blocking a vote on the Equality Act. In 2022, when Irish comedian Graham Norton was asked about transgender policies and J.K. Rowling, he deliberately sidestepped mentioning J.K. Rowling and said that people shouldn't talk to celebrities for their opinion on trans people and should probably talk to trans people themselves or to doctors. But when someone quote tweeted that clip, J.K. Rowling saw it and she said this: "Very much enjoying the recent spate of bearded men stepping confidently onto their soapboxes to define what a woman is and throw their support behind rape and death threats to those who dare disagree. You may mock, but takes real bravery to come out as an Old Testament prophet." This led to Norton getting a lot of harassment, and he ended up deactivating his Twitter account in response. And another time on Twitter, when someone had asked J.K. Rowling how she sleeps at night knowing how her words have affected fans and former fans of her books, she tweeted this response: "I read my most recent royalty checks and find the pain goes away pretty quickly." The Harry Potter series is over. Kind of, maybe. But its legacy and influence hasn't. Many people still talk about how important Harry Potter is to them. And many people find it difficult to say that you could separate Rowling from her books when she is still actively receiving money from that franchise. The death of the author is a way to analyze media that says that it's the consumer that determines the meaning, not the creator themselves. And while there are plenty of instances where it is beneficial to try and kill the author, it's also important to be mindful of what details might be dying with them.